What's up, Scampers? Welcome back to another video. This video is going to go over the basics of the Scamp electrical system. As always, everything I use and demonstrate will be linked in the description below. But let's start with some electrical basics. So basically what you need to understand is that the RV has two different power systems in one. There's AC and there's DC, but my brain can't keep track of which one's which, so I prefer to refer to them as 120 volt and 12 volt. And if you think about it, 120 is way higher than 12. So 120 volt is like the power system you have at home where you plug something into the wall, there's electricity, it just works, the outlet is live. 12 volt is battery power. So it's kind of easy to think about it if you think of 120 volt is like a lot more power and 12 volt is battery power. So those are two separate systems that do vastly different things, but can work together as one. That was a lot of numbers and information really quickly, so if you're new to this topic, that might have been kind of confusing, but don't worry, I'm going to break it down piece by piece, step by step, and by the end of this video, it should make a lot more sense. So let's start with your 120 volt connection. That is the plug that comes with your Scamp. It's the one that you connect to the power podium at a campground that has hookups. So when you see this cable, this big thick wire, you associate that with your 120 volt connection. And if you have a hard time remembering, I like to think about the thickness of the cable kind of like a pipe. The bigger the water pipe, the more water can flow through it at once, right? So you have this big thick cable, you can kind of associate that with the most power coming through the cable at once. So when you plug your trailer in to the 30 amp connection, you've got your 120 volt connection that can power your highest draw appliances like your AC or your microwave. If you have a microwave, the really heavy duty stuff is going to be powered through this big thick cable. So you might be thinking, you just referred to that as a 120 volt connection and a 30 amp connection in the same sentence. That is correct. Volts are different than amps, but really all you need to understand about 30 amp is that it is the configuration that your power cord comes with. So these three prongs right here, the hook into these three prongs right here, that's what I mean by a 30 amp connection. It's a 30 amp power cord that supplies 120 volts. If you have a 50 amp trailer, then you're going to have a power cord that looks like this. It'll have the 4 prongs. So 30 amp connection has 3 prongs, 50 amp connection has 4 prongs. That's really all I'm referring to when I say a 30 amp connection. I just mean this configuration for the plug right here. Next thing you're going to do is look at your power podium and see what kind of hookup you have at your campsite. So if you look right here, you can count the 1, 2, 3, 30 amp connection. So this is compatible with the trailer that I have, but if for some reason the campsite only had a 50 amp connection, I always carry one of these adapters. These are dog bone adapters. You can find them anywhere. They're not super expensive, but this has got the 50 amp side, 1, 2, 3, 4, and changes it into a 30 amp connection, 1, 2, 3. So all I would have to do is plug the 50 amp side in first, and I could plug my trailer into the 30 amp and it would become compatible with a 50 amp connection. So since I have a 30 amp connection here, my trailer is already compatible with the configuration, and I've also got a 15 amp outlet right here. So 15 amp connection is like an extension cord you're used to seeing the outlets you have at home. Pretty self-explanatory. Most people understand this one. And the box is going to come with some breakers on it. So right now the breakers are turned off. So if I plugged everything in and didn't flip the breakers on, nothing would get any power. And I've got a breaker for my 30 amp connection right here. And this one's actually for the 15 amp connection. It's a little confusing because it says 20, but that'll power the 15 amp connection right here. This breaker is for the 30 amp connection right here. So if you plug your trailer in and nothing's working, the first thing you want to check is to make sure that your breakers are flipped into the on position. Now it's time to plug in my trailer. I know I have a 30 amp cord coming from the trailer and I have a 30 amp connection at my campsite. So I know they're compatible, but there's a simple thing you can put between your trailer and the power podium to protect your trailer and all the sensitive electronics inside, because there's a thing where campground electricity can be unreliable. There can be a reverse polarity, there can be surges, and all those things can damage the sensitive electronics in your trailer. All you have to do is get yourself a simple surge protector to put between the podium and your trailer, and this will have warning lights and all kinds of things that can go wrong, a little cheat sheet right there. You plug this in, flip on your breaker, and the lights will come on your surge protector and tell you if it's safe to plug in your trailer or not. So I've got the green light and the blue light, which means everything is hunky-dory. I'm safe to plug my trailer in. So now I've got my surge protector on, I can plug my trailer directly into the surge protector and I've got my 120 volt power that is coming into the trailer safely, protected by a surge protector. If I was at a campground that didn't have the 30 amp connection and only had the 15 amp connection, if I didn't bring myself an adapter to go from 30 amps to 15 amps, I wouldn't be able to plug in at all. But I carry this little adapter that I can put right into the 15 amp connection. And now I can plug my 30 amp connection, my surge protector, right into the 15 amp connector. Surge protector will still work. I can still use a limited amount of power through the 15 amp connection. Again, if you think of the cable you're using like a water pipe and you compare that, look at the size difference. Using the same analogy as the water pipe, if you look at this pipe, a lot more can flow through it than this one at the same time. Look at the difference. This one is double the size, 15 amp, 30 amp. The numbers help you remember which one's bigger. But when you look at the power cable, you got to think, I can only use so much electricity at once when I'm using a 15 amp connection. So if I adapt my 30 amp down to a 15 amp connection, I wouldn't want to be running my air conditioner and say like a hair dryer or a bunch of high draw appliances at once. If I try to run the AC for very long through the 15 amp connection, it's not going to have enough capacity in this 15 amp cord to run such a high draw appliance for very long. So it might flip the breaker inside the trailer, or it might not run at all because this 15 amp cable doesn't have the capacity that the 30 amp does. The 30 amp has double the capacity of the 15 amp. So if you think about the numbers and associate them with capacity, it'll help you remember that when you're adapting down to a little cable like a 15 amp connection, you have to be careful how many things you try to power at once. And even though your microwave would run, if you have a microwave, you wouldn't want to try to run your microwave and your AC at the same time, and you might not be able to run your AC at all. So 30 amp connection is preferable because it's what the trailer is designed to run on. But if you have to adapt down to a 15 amp, just carry a little adapter and be aware of your power usage. And a question I see a lot is, do I need to get a surge protector for the 50 amp connection if I ever end up at a campground that only has 50 amp? The answer is no. You can use this same adapter. You plug the 50 amp into the 50 amp connection, then you plug your surge protector into the 30 amp connection, and you plug your trailer into the surge protector just like normal. So as long as you carry one of these adapters, you'll never get to a campsite and be like, oh crap, I can't plug in because there's only a 50 amp connection, or I can't plug in because there's only a 15 amp connection. So carry a 50 to 30 amp adapter and a 15 to 30 amp adapter. And then no matter what kind of power you end up with, you'll be able to use it. When you're using adapters, something you need to understand is they're not just adapting, they're also reducing. So even if I plugged into a 50 amp connection, it's getting reduced to a 30 amp connection. And my cable for my trailer is still only 30 amps. So my trailer is not going to magically become a 50 amp powered trailer. It's still getting reduced to 30 amps. So same thing if you reduce down to 15 amps. Yes, you're plugging in your 30 amp power cord, but the source you're drawing from is still only 15 amps. So you need to understand that anytime you use an adapter, you're reducing it to, and use your power accordingly. So don't expect to have a 30 amp connection when you use a 15 amp adapter. The power coming into the podium, the wire that's in there is still the thin 15 amp wire. So it doesn't magically become 30 when you use this adapter. So anytime you use an adapter, know that it's also a reducer. When it's time to plug this thing in, you just want to pay attention to this one right here that has the little L-shaped connection. You got to find the prong that also looks L-shaped and line those two up for this to fit correctly. Press it in there really tight, and then never neglect this step of screwing it in and sealing it down. Your biggest enemy when it comes to electricity is corrosion, and a loose connection can lead to corrosion really quickly. So you want to make sure it's in nice and snug. You've got it screwed on tight. Now we know how to plug in our trailer, get our 120 volt connection, and how to protect it with a surge protector. Something important to remember about the 120 volt system is it has to be plugged in to be functional. There isn't a way to run your 120 volt system off your battery. That's the 12 volt system that we'll get to later. So if you want to use high draw appliances like your air conditioner, or if you have a microwave, that's all going to be running from your 120 volt 30 amp connection. Now that we know how to get it plugged in and make sure our 120 volt connection is coming into the trailer, there's an easy way to make sure that it's working. The easiest way to check to make sure that the 120 volt is coming into the trailer correctly is to check your battery monitor. If your battery is getting a number reading between 13.2 and 14.4, that means it's getting charged by the 120 volt system. So if you come in here and your gauge reads something between 13.2 and 14.4, you know you're hooked up correctly and it's working. And if you're jealous of my brand new battery gauge cover, there's a company called Scamp Co on Etsy that's making these amazing covers that block out the light so you can actually sleep at night. So they're making this one here, and they also make one for the USB port over here. So even when you're charging, it blocks out the light. Without these things, you take them off of here, that blue light drives me nuts at night. So if you get these things from Scamp Co, they just cover up that blue light so you can still charge. It comes through a little, but it makes such a big difference. We sleep so much better at night. So thank you, Scamp Co. But anyway, now that we know that we're getting power into the trailer and that it's coming through correctly, let's talk about what it does. All that power that's coming in from the power podium is going to run through your power control center. This is where mine is. It's under the bed or the dinette. You just open this little portion right here. These are your breakers on this side. These are your fuses on this side. The difference here is that the 120 volt power system runs through the breakers. So anytime you're using your connection in your really high draw appliances, they're going to come through these breakers to protect the system. If it gets overloaded, it'll trip the breaker. So instead of burning up your wires, it'll shut off and you can reset it. All of the 12 volt battery system runs through the fuses. So if you ever forget where the power for stuff comes from, this is like a cheat sheet. It tells you exactly what everything's powering. And you can look at this and say, okay, if it's on the fuse side, then I know it's coming from the battery. If it's on the breaker side, I know that it's coming from the electrical hookup, the 120 volt 30 amp connection. So if you look at the top here, we've got kind of our main circuits right here. If we look down here, this is our refrigerator / microwave. I don't have a microwave, but if I did, that would run through that breaker right there. This is my converter and all of my outlets. This one's my water heater, and this is my air conditioner. So these are things that I can run on my 120 volt system. They will always run on the 120 volt system unless they have a 12 volt brain in them. Things like the fridge have a 12 volt brain in them, so I can run them off my battery. I just will drain my battery if I don't end up recharging that power somehow. Things like my air conditioner will only ever run on 120 volt. Things like my 15 amp outlets will only ever run on the 120 volt. Things like my water heater can go back and forth between the battery system and the 120 volt. And we'll go through all of these individually, so don't get overwhelmed. But say you're using something like your air conditioner through the 120 volt system, and all of a sudden it shuts off, you might have tripped the breaker. So all you have to do is come in here, flip it off, flip it back on again, and it should reset it, and you should be able to turn your AC back on. So anything that goes wrong with your 120 volt will be breakers. Anything that goes wrong with your battery, you need to check your fuses. So right here you have an example of all the different outlets that this Scamp comes with. You'll notice this one looks just like the 15 amp connection that we already discussed outside. That's the one you're used to seeing at home and used to using. That one is your 120 volt outlet. So remember, 120 volt always has to be plugged in for it to be on. So when you see this one, you associate it with the 120 volt system. You know it has to be plugged in, or these won't work at all. You can plug this in when you're, say, connected to your tow vehicle or boondocking, and nothing will happen. These won't get power unless they're plugged in, because the 120 volt system has to be plugged in to get power. The alternative, Scamp was nice enough to label this side over here as the 12 volt, so you can remember this whole side is your 12 volt system. So remember I said they're two separate systems. The 12 volt system is running off your battery. So as long as your battery is good and you've got your main battery switch on, these ones will always have power. These ones will always be on. My goodness, if I can open it. This is the 12 volt port, which we used to call the cigarette lighter. This one here has a couple of USBs in it. These ones basically go 12 volt to 12 volt. So when you charge a battery, you're using 12 volts. So you can plug your cell phone in, you can plug in other small USB powered devices, and you're charging from your battery in the trailer to the battery in the small device. It goes directly 12 volt to 12 volt. It doesn't need to be converted or inverted. These run directly off your battery. So as long as your battery's good and your battery's on, these ones are always on. You can use these whether you're hooked up to your tow vehicle. You can use them when you're boondocking. You just need to remember that these are drawing from your battery, so you have to keep an eye on your battery level if you're using these a lot. Another appliance we saw listed on the 120 volt side of the breaker box was the refrigerator. The refrigerator in my 2023 Scamp is electric only. A lot of other versions have 3-way fridges, which can run off propane, but mine doesn't. It's electric only. So I can run it off of battery power, but I need to remember that it's going to drain the battery pretty quickly. So when I hook up to the 120 volt connection, the fridge will know to switch over to that 120 volt system. And I basically have endless power to run the fridge as long as I'm connected to that 120 volt system. But as soon as I unplug my trailer and I switch to the 12 volt battery power, this will still run on that battery power, but it's going to drain it pretty quickly. So I'll need to find other ways to supplement charging my battery, like solar or portable power station, if I want to run my fridge for a long time and I don't have the 120 volt connection at a campground. So right about now, you're probably realizing that the trailer gives you multiple ways to power things. That's why there's two systems that are separate but work together. If you have your 120 volt connection, you can use that. But if you don't, when you're driving, if you're boondocking, you've got the battery system to run most things in the trailer without having to be hooked up. But there are certain things like your air conditioning that will only ever run on the 120 volt system. You'll never be able to run that off your battery. Yes, people with bigger RVs do have massive solar systems and massive battery banks, and they are able to run AC off the grid, but there's just not the kind of space that you need to pull that off in a Scamp. So if you're going to run your AC, you either need to have your 120 volt 30 amp connection hooked up, or you can run a generator and you can power your AC with a generator when you're off the grid. Something important to note about your AC though is that it's controlled through the thermostat. At least in my 2023 version, the thermostat is what will tell the AC to kick on. And the thermostat has a 12 volt brain. But an important thing to note is that the thermostat itself has a couple of AAA batteries. So if those ever die while you're out on an excursion, you won't even be able to use your heat because you need your thermostat to control all of that. So just make sure you carry a couple extra spare batteries and know that your thermostat runs through the 12 volt system. So if you have any problems with your thermostat, you're going to need to check the 12 volt side of your power control center and check all your fuses. And if you caught my last video, you already know all about the water heater. So if you want to deep dive into that, go check out that video when you're done watching this one. But the long and short of that one is that you do need electrical power to run the water heater. Even though it is propane operated, you still need the electricity to run the fan and the electrical components in the water heater. So you either need to be plugged in or understand that using your water heater is going to contribute to draining your battery. That pretty much covers the basics of the 120 volt AC system. Let's move on to the battery and talk about the 12 volt DC system and things you can and can't do when you don't have connections and you're just running off your battery. So for reference, your battery is up here in the box that's on the tongue of your trailer, and if your battery is installed correctly and it has a charge, it's basically always on unless you use the main kill switch inside the trailer. So you don't really need to open this box or do anything. You just turn the battery switch on inside the trailer and it's on. There are a few troubleshooting things that we'll go through later that might involve opening this box, but unless you're having a problem, you don't really ever have to open this or worry about it. A key piece to using your 12 volt battery system is making sure that your main battery cutoff switch is set to on when you're using it and or charging it. If you have this switched off but you're plugged in, you won't actually be charging your battery. So make sure that your main battery shutoff switch is in the vertical position, the on position, if you want to use your battery or charge your battery. When you switch this to horizontal, that's the shutoff position, and that's meant for when you put the trailer into storage or you're not using it. You can kill the battery to everything that might draw the battery down over time, like the little lights on the propane detector. Little things like that are kind of always on will slowly drain your battery over time. So that's what your battery shutoff switch is for, is to protect it from slow drain when you're not using it. But if you want to charge your battery, you have to make sure you have your battery shutoff switch in the on position. Now that we're just talking about the 12 volt battery system, let's talk about stuff that you can use for a long time without really worrying too much about draining your battery. The lights in the trailer are LED. They're super duper efficient. They're designed to run off the battery for a long time without draining the battery quickly. The fan is also designed to be super efficient and run off battery power for extended periods of time without drawing your battery down too quickly. Your water pumps, if you have a sink, you've got a water pump that draws from your fresh tank. And if you've got a bathroom, you've got a water pump that drains from your shower basin. Those are both able to run off your battery, and they're both pretty efficient. You can run them with just your battery for a good while without worrying about your battery draining. All of those things are designed to be super efficient, so you can run them for a good while just on your battery without any kind of supplemental power source. You always want to keep an eye on your battery state of charge because, as we'll discuss in a little bit, if you go too low too often on your battery, it'll really shorten the lifespan of your battery. But those items are all things that you can run without worrying about too much. Just keep an eye on your battery gauge and make sure that you're not going below 50%. Things that will run on your 12-volt battery system but will drain them a lot more quickly are, as we discussed, your fridge. The fridge is all electric in my 2023 version. Unless you have a 3-way fridge, then you can run yours off propane. The propane ones are a lot more efficient, but mine's only electric. So my biggest power vampire from my 12-volt system is my fridge. So if I want to run that fridge for more than a day or two at a time, I have to supplement my battery power. Same thing goes for my furnace. The furnace is propane powered. The heat comes from the propane, but there's a fan inside the furnace that draws from your battery. So if you're running that fan, say you have it set to like 80 degrees, 75 degrees, and it's running consistently all night, with the battery power only, the fan in the furnace is going to drain your battery pretty quickly. So if you want to run the furnace through the night, a Group 27 battery upgrade is highly recommended, or you need to set it lower and use a lot more warm blankets so it's kicking on and off intermittently, because if you run it straight through the night, it could drain your battery. You could wake up to a dead battery. I mentioned keeping an eye on your battery state of charge. So the newer Scamps come with this little voltmeter or battery gauge. And if you don't know anything about these numbers, they can be a little bit deceiving. I did talk about how when you're plugged in, the number will be 13 or higher. But when you aren't plugged in and you're just running off your battery power, a fully charged battery will read 12.7 volts. So when you unplug and this drops down to 12.7, that doesn't mean something wrong with your battery. It just means that it comes in higher than the full battery charge number states. So if your gauge reads 12.7 volts, that's a fully charged battery system. What I really appreciate about these voltmeter battery gauges that Scamp provides is the color coding. You've got green, yellow, and red. With lead acid batteries, you want to keep your battery above 50% at all times. It's a good rule of thumb. Anytime you drop the battery lower than 50%, it's going to do damage to the lifetime of your battery. If you go below 50% too many times, it might not come back. So green means you're in the over 50% level, because the numbers can be a little deceiving. You see 12.7 is full, so you think, oh, 6 point something is half, but that's not actually how it works. I'll put a little chart on the screen, but on the lead acid batteries that come from the Scamp factory, 12.23 is actually the 50% charge level. So 12.7 will be full. You start getting close to 12.23, you're at basically half capacity, and it's time to charge your battery or shut everything off, or you might do damage to your battery that affects how long it'll last in the future. But what I don't like about these little battery gauges is that they can be a little bit deceiving. When I'm running off battery power and I have things on like my fridge, or I'm running my fan or my lights, it'll actually show a lower number than the state of charge just because there's stuff on the battery drawing from it. So if you want to get a true reading of what your battery actually is and you're running strictly off battery power, you have to shut everything in the Scamp off and let it rest for a minute to get your true battery reading. If you're plugging along on battery power only and you see this getting into the yellow and you go, oh shoot, I might be too low, just shut everything off for a minute and that'll give you a more true reading of your battery state of charge. But you definitely want to keep this over 50% charge level to keep your battery healthy. And just to reiterate for good measure, once we don't have hookups, you can't use this 15 amp 120 volt connection right here, but you can use your 12 volt power connection. So your USB and your cigarette lighter or 12 volt port will still work, but you just want to make sure that you're paying attention to all the various things that you're using from your battery, and keep an eye on your battery state of charge to make sure you're not getting too low. And again, if you want one of these awesome USB covers to block the light out so you can sleep better, or the battery gauge cover, I will put a link to this Etsy down below so you can get some of these too, because they are game changers, and I'm really grateful that somebody took the time to create some and they're a perfect fit. So if you want them to, I'll link those below. And again, now that we're operating strictly on battery power, the AC unit becomes unusable. Has to be plugged in to use it, or you need a generator or a massive power station to run your AC. So if you don't have hookups, don't plan on air conditioning. And lastly, your water heater is designed to be able to run without the 120 volt connection, but it's something you need to understand. If you're using it consistently, can drain your battery more quickly. As you can see, Winter is very curious to know how you supplement your battery power if you're going to camp somewhere without connection. So there are several ways to charge your battery that don't include plugging in. When you're hooked up to your tow vehicle, your 7-way plug will actually charge your battery while you're connected and you're driving. The alternator in your tow vehicle will send a charge to your battery. If you have an electric fridge like I do and you have it set really high while you're driving, it might balance out to zero. You might be sending just enough power to offset the drain, and you might arrive at your campsite without any more charge than you left from home with. So if you have an electric fridge, that's something to keep in mind. But if you have your fridge set really low, or you have a three-way fridge, then chances are while you're driving, you're going to get a charge from your tow vehicle. You can charge your battery with solar. I have a permanently mounted panel, and I did a whole video on how I installed this. So if you're interested, you can check that one out. But they also have solar panel suitcases that you can just deploy when you want to charge your battery, fold up, put away. Either one will work. You just want to make sure that you have a charge controller between your battery and your solar panel to make sure you don't overcharge your battery and do damage to it because you're filling it up too much. Other supplemental power sources include generators and portable power stations. You can plug directly into those without the surge protector because they both provide clean energy that goes directly to your battery through your converter. Your converter is a thing that comes pre-installed on your Scamp. It is what takes your 120 volt power when you have connections. You're using your 30 amp cord. You put that into your trailer. It goes through your converter, and your converter converts it into power that can be added to your 12 volt battery. So all the things that run on 12 volt that only ever run on 12 volt, when you're plugged in, the converter is charging the battery as you use them, which is why you never run out of power when you have your 120 volt connection. Your stuff doesn't automatically become 120 volt powered. It just converts the energy, inputs it into the battery, and the battery stays charged as you use stuff because there's a constant source of energy coming in. The thing to understand about using a portable power station to power your trailer through your cord, your 30 amp connection, power stations either have that 30 amp connection or 15, and you can adapt to it with the adapters I showed you, but it's just not the most efficient way to charge your trailer battery. What happens is the power station has an inverter, so it turns battery power into 120 volt power. It goes from DC to AC, goes into your trailer directly to your converter, where your converter switches it back from AC to DC. It goes from 120 volt back to 12 volt. That's a really confusing way of saying that you're losing a little bit of power by inverting and converting it. But I use my portable power station like a second house battery all the time, and it's efficient. And if you don't want to invest in solar, it's a really easy way to have like a second house battery and supplemental power for your trailer. Now that we've got more understanding of how the two separate systems in the trailer work and how they combine to work together, let's talk about a little bit of troubleshooting. There's a small amount of troubleshooting you can do without a multimeter, but I recommend always having a multimeter with you and learning how to use it. I'm going to do a whole separate video on the multimeter and exactly how to use it. I'll do a tutorial on that later, but having one with you will help you diagnose your electrical problems much more thoroughly. But if you're out and about without a multimeter, these are some things that I would check first to see what's going on with my electrical system if something goes awry. If I'm working with electrical hookups and a power podium and suddenly something goes awry, the very first thing I would check would be the fuses on the power podium. So I would make sure that these didn't get tripped, make sure that they're on. And then secondly, I would make sure I have a good solid connection, and I would take a second to look at all of my connections here. And if they have this good brass color, then I know there's no corrosion. If you look at this, it should be a color similar to this. If it starts turning and looking more like copper, then that's the first sign of corrosion, and you're going to want to address that. I'll do a whole maintenance video later, but corrosion is your biggest enemy when you're working with electricity. So you want to check your surge protector connection. This one's still brass, looks good. I would unplug it. Check my trailer cords connection. Still looks good, still looking like brass, no copper color, so I know those are good. I would make sure I have a really secure and really tight fit coming into the trailer. And then if that's good, I would go back to my control panel and start checking my breakers inside and my fuses. Back in here at our power control center, I would just check to make sure I haven't tripped any of my breakers here. And if all of those are good, you can try just clicking them off and clicking them back on. That's a good way to reset everything. Then you want to check your fuses. If you have a multimeter, you can check all your fuses without taking them out of here. But if not, just carry a little fuse puller. You can reach in there and grab it, pull it out with this little fuse puller because it's hard to do with your hands. And then you're going to want to look at the little connection. See if I can get that to focus on there. That little wire in there is what you're looking at. If it burns out, there'll be a break in that little wire. You'll see they're not connected anymore. But if your wire looks like that, one solid piece. The fuse is good. You can plop it back in there and move on to the next fuse and try the next one. I do carry a box of auto fuses with me, which has all the various sizes that are in the trailer. It's really small and compact. I'll link this in the description below, because if a fuse blows when you're on a trip and you don't have a spare, you're kind of SOL. So carrying some auto fuses with you and a fuse puller or a multimeter is a really good choice. Next, if everything checked out at the power podium and everything checked out with my fuses and my breakers inside the trailer, I would come take a look at the battery. So the battery's inside this box. All you have to do is pop it open. The lid comes right off if you don't have your solar cable in the way like I do. And you just want to take a look at these connections where all of your terminals are. Right here underneath this nut is where everything's connected. And you can see that mine looks shiny and silver, so there isn't any corrosion there. So without a multimeter, all I can really do is look at this and look for corrosion. Again, corrosion is your worst enemy. So if I did open this up and find corrosion, I carry this little wire brush with me. I could scrape the terminals and kind of clean off all the gunk, reconnect everything. And that's basically all I could do without a multimeter. But that's another reason that I would carry a multimeter, is I could put it right up against these terminals and the multimeter would tell me if my battery was good or not. So without carrying a multimeter, I would at least carry a wire brush so you can clean your battery terminals in the case of corrosion. Then you want to just make sure that you put your battery box back on and seal it on there with the strap, because your box is what helps you fight corrosion, and keeping it out of the weather is going to keep that battery and the terminals cleaner. And lastly, if all the other stuff checked out, the last thing I would look at is the converter. It is underneath the bench seat on the driver's side of the trailer in my 2023 version, right behind the fuse and breaker box. And there is a cable, a power cord that plugs into the back of it. And sometimes when you're driving, that can rattle loose. So I'm not going to get in there and show it to you, because I replaced all of my cushions with a mattress that's very heavy and I'm just too lazy to do that. But that would be the last thing you would do, is get under the bench seat on your driver's side, look for the box that says converter, and just look that the power cord in the back of that box is still firmly inserted and attached. But that pretty much covers the Scamp electrical basics. If you have any questions I didn't answer, just go ahead and put them in the comments below and I'll get right back to you. But if you enjoy this kind of content, you can support me by using the link to my tip jar that I put in the video description. But if that's not within your means, don't feel obligated. Ways you can help the channel is to like, subscribe, ring the bell, and share it with a friend. All of the ways you interact with this video will tell YouTube the video is worth watching and spread it to a bigger audience. So any way you can help support the channel, I am so grateful. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this one, check out some of my other videos while you're here, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy scamping!